Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been practicing with thousands of patients for over 25 years. And this channel is a wide variety of wellness tips to help you handle stress and be healthy and happy. So, this video is part two of shame and guilt. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk more about shame and guilt, and this is part two of the three-part series on shame and guilt. So if you haven't watched part one, I'll put a link up at the top right here. Go watch that one, and then come watch part two, and this one will make more sense. So in part one, I talked about the basic understanding of shame versus guilt versus embarrassment versus sadness versus regret, remorse, and these basic concepts in order to understand how does shame and guilt happen and what's the difference between, broadly speaking, constructive and destructive shame and guilt. So in this video, I'm going to dive a little more deeply into what we mean by toxic shame and how shame and guilt become toxic. So in particular, I'm going to talk about cognitive distortions that cause shame to be toxic, as well as some other ways that shame and guilt can be toxic parts of our emotional lives. And the main cognitive distortions that tend to contribute to toxicity are irrational expectations, personalization, and overgeneralization. And those are the ways that shame can be more likely to be triggered and also more likely to be toxic. So let me give you some examples of that, and then I'll talk about some other ways that shame and guilt can be toxic. So with shame, in part one, you remember I was saying that shame results from a violation of a fundamental expectation. But cognitive distortions are ways that our mind twists our perceptions and appraisals of our perceptions so that we're more likely to have a shame reaction because of the distortion, not necessarily because the fundamental expectation is one that is rational and that everybody would agree is acceptable. And so I'll give you an example of an irrational distortion that results in shame. I'll use an example from my own life. So if I look back into my childhood and I try to remember, like, when is one of the first times that I felt profound shame, that was 100% shame. One of the earliest memories of that was one time when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and I was at school, and I was talking to this girl that I had this crazy crush on. I was wildly attracted to her. At the time, I thought she probably didn't know it. I'm sure in retrospect, she probably knew it. But so I'm having this relatively benign, casual conversation with her one day. And in the middle of the conversation, I said something that wasn't wrong in the sense that she would have thought I said something wrong or inappropriate. It's just that in the middle of one of these sentences, and I can't even remember the exact term that causes to happen now because I'm 55. I'm thinking back to age 11, right? But there was this one moment where I used a term that was actually correct, but it wasn't the most correct term. There existed a better term for the thing that I referred to in this sentence, okay? Now, as a setup to why this was shameful, I was kind of precocious in reading when I was young. When I was like 7, I started reading the encyclopedia and the dictionary for fun. So by the time I'm 11, I've got a pretty good vocabulary, and I'm kind of a nerd in the sense of wanting to be precise with language still to this day. And maybe this is a fault for some of the ways I make these videos. You can leave comments below if you think I'm a nerd in that way and I ought to work on it. Anyway, that's an aside. But in this moment, I'm 11. I'm kind of a language nerd. And in the middle of this sentence that I'm already kind of stressed about because I'm talking to this girl that I like, I say this word that was actually the right word. It's just there was a more right word in existence. And in the half a millisecond after that word left my mouth, my brain registered that I could have said a better word, and I instantly froze because I felt like my face got red. I felt this profound shame, right? And I literally froze in the sense like I had no idea what to do or how to cope. And I felt such profound shame that I stood up and I ran away, right? So now I can laugh at it, right? Time has passed. At the time, it was mortifying, and really, if you ask me, like, what's the first moment in your life you can remember being profoundly mortified? That's it. Now, you may be sitting there saying, John, that is stupid. That's silly. And the reason you're probably saying that, if you are, is because my expectation that I'm going to be that precise is irrational. And also the additional expectation that she even had any sort of clue that it happened, right? Because I actually said something that was grammatically correct, contextually correct, and technically correct because I used the correct term for the thing. There just happened to be a better term in existence. I'm sure she was perplexed because, like, so what happened was I ran away from that conversation. And then later, anytime I saw this poor little girl, I actually avoided her and never interacted with her again in my life because I was so full of shame. Okay. Irrational and disproportionate. Right. So, was my shame profound because it was such a strong violation of such a fundamental, expectation? Technically, yes, but not because it was like a universally valid fundamental expectation. Like I said in part one, when I used an example about autonomy of the body, for example, um, that might be very universal. That one was shameful because I had this irrational expectation about the pureness of my linguistic precision, 100% pure. And also an irrational kind of belief that she somehow psychically knew that I could have said a better word in that sentence, right? So irrational expectations are cognitive distortions that contribute to both the shame trigger and the maintenance of shame once it's happened, right? Now, why is that not maintained for me to this day? Because today I have a perspective that takes away the irrational part, and I can look back and actually laugh at the fact that I was attached to that level of pureness about linguistic terms, right? But irrational beliefs contribute to shame by producing that particular type of cognitive distortion. Another one is personalization. So when we over personalize something that's actually not something we should take personal, we can feel shame. So let's say there's a group of new friends that I want to impress, and I throw an event where I'm going to have a picnic, near a lake on a certain day, and I invite people. And then that morning, storm clouds roll in and it just starts pouring rain, and half the people don't show up and the other half show up and say, what are we going to do? There's no plan B. Let's just bail and do it another time. I feel shame maybe in that moment because I'm personalizing the outcome of the event. I'm personalizing the fact that bad weather happened. I can't control the weather, but I'm personalizing the consequence of rain, right? So when we personalize things that are actually not things we should personalize, we open our vulnerability to feeling shame around bad outcomes, right? Another one is overgeneralization. So a cognitive distortion, overgeneralization can contribute to shame in a variety of ways. And here's an example. Um, I live in a college town and practice in a college town, so I see students, a lot. It's not uncommon to see a student who's like in their end of their freshman semester, and they're totally mortified and shame-filled because they didn't have a great first semester in college for whatever reasons. And so they came in with this expectation that they're going to, like, be an honor student throughout, and they're going to have this high GPA that then helps them get into grad school, and the whole thing ends up helping them have the career of their dreams. And they have this first semester that bombs, or let's say doesn't do great. And then they have this overgeneralization that one bad semester means totally bad undergrad career, which means I can't get into the grad schools I want, which means I can't have the career I want, right? So they're overgeneralizing this specific semester outcome to a lot of extra things. That's overgeneralization. And so then they're already participating in the shame of failure of their entire career when what they actually had was a bad semester, right? So overgeneralization. Another issue that comes up is, and this is another cognitive distortion, is the kind of skewed perception of locus of control and responsibility. So, for example, this comes up sometimes when I'm talking with survivors of someone who died and they're processing their grief. And it's not uncommon for a survivor, who was close to the person who died, to then get into what if thinking. And the what if thinking sometimes includes saying to themselves, well, if I had, before they died, told them that they ought to do this differently, then maybe they would have had a better life. Or maybe I would be doing better if I'd gotten them to do X, Y, and Z different before they died, because that would have set me up to be able to deal with this better. Right. So like if let's say this person says, my marriage partner of all my life died and they always did the balancing of the checkbook, and now they died and I'm having all this stress because I can't balance a checkbook easily. I'm not used to doing it. And now I'm mad because I didn't prod them to teach me how to do it before they died. And now I'm mad at myself for being mad at them. They died. I shouldn't be mad at a dead person. And now I'm frustrated with the whole situation. And I feel this shame and guilt because I could have not had all this madness at them and myself if I had asked them to teach me how to do the checkbook before they died. Right. So, it's a misperception of locus of control and responsibility because maybe they didn't know the person was going to die. They didn't, think that it was going to be an issue, right? It's not their fault for not thinking about the checkbook issue in the middle of, let's say, taking care of someone with a severe critical illness leading up to their death. So they have this skewed kind of locus of control issue and responsibility that's all adding up to a situation of shame while they're going through the grief process, right? So that's another way that cognitive distortion can promote shame. Another way that shame gets promoted is when it becomes kind of a habitual, insidious kind of shame where it does hit you at your self-esteem level, and then self-esteem gets lowered so that that's consequential in choices that mean that you're more likely to choose behaviors that are risky or potentially shame-inducing. And so then it becomes a shame cycle. And so when then the additional things cause shame, it reifies the whole effect of shame. It's every shame hit is another hit to self-esteem and identity. And so then low self-esteem means more engagement in behaviors that risk having a shame-inducing experience, right? And that's a way that a shame cycle can happen. And another one is when our emotional regulation gets miswired so that when A happens and a congruent emotion happens or starts to happen, shame and guilt get induced for some reason because you get a miswiring of the normal emotional regulation process. An example of this would be someone who's a super avoider in conflict. So garden variety avoiders just kind of keep their mouth shut rather than open their mouth and start a conflict because they want to avoid conflict. But super avoiders do more than that because just keeping your mouth shut won't work with somebody who knows you, right? So if I'm supposed to meet a really, really close friend who knows me really, really well for lunch and they show up like 30 minutes late and I'm frustrated with them, if I keep my mouth shut and don't say that I'm frustrated, they may still suss that out because they know me so well and they can like read that on my face just even when I'm not like literally explicitly saying I'm frustrated that you're so late, right? So a regular avoider is still at risk of not being able to totally avoid a conflict, even if they choose to avoid it by just keeping their mouth shut. So a super avoider might do something like this. They learn internally how to instantly and magically transmute anger, frustration and anger into shame and guilt. And so, like, I'm sitting in the restaurant, let's say, waiting for the other person to arrive. I'm starting to feel frustration that they're so late, but then I transmute it into, oh man, this is probably my fault. I should have texted or emailed them to remind them that we were going to meet. This is my fault. And then when they show up, instead of saying nothing or saying, hey, why are you so late? Then what I say is, oh, I'm sorry I didn't send you an email to remind you that we were going to meet today. So I make it my fault, a misperception of misassignment of locus of control and responsibility. And I also internally transmute my frustration into shame and guilt because it's a more pure way to avoid a possible conflict, right? Super avoiders are likely to do that kind of thing. But there are other ways that shame and guilt get miswired in terms of internal emotional responses. If you want to look closely at your emotional responses, a really good book to train you how to look into that space where triggers happen and you quickly end up in a certain place that may not be optimal. A really good book for that is Emotional Agility. And I did a review on that recently, so I'll put a link up here in the top if you want to go check out that review of that book, because it's a good book for getting better at the capacity to looking at that really tight little space, tight in time between a trigger and an emotional and a cognitive response. And if you're working with complex emotional kinds of miswirings like that, that book is a good resource to use as part of your path to getting more healthy, right? So these are a few of the ways that shame can kind of go beyond just being, oh, I violated a fundamental expectation and now I feel some shame, to hopefully, in this video, hopefully you understand a little more about just how it becomes toxic, right? Now, if you're watching this video, I expect that this is already a topic of interest to you because you've had a moment of really profound shame, or you're exploring how shame and guilt work in your own life. And I don't want you to think that this video was an attempt to be comprehensive in a survey of all the ways that shame and guilt can be toxic. But I wanted to deepen the first video without making the first video twice as long, to just say some additional thoughts about some ways that shame and guilt actually can become more insidious in our identity, in our ways of perceiving and reacting, and become more toxic, right? So this is part 2, and in the next part, which would be the third of this 3-part sequence on shame and guilt, I want to actually lay out some of the paths that people follow in order to become more healthy and to detoxify shame and guilt once they have become toxic. So watch that one next. And again, thanks for joining me on this channel. If you like this kind of content, feel very free to hit the like button below. Feel free to comment and share. And also, if you like the channel, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in part 3.